We're so glad that you could join us today for our Energy Innovation Forum on the Texas hydrogen economy. The goal of Energy Innovation Forums is to bring together academics, community leaders, industry leaders, and policymakers to explore the ins and outs of emerging energy technologies to help inform policy solutions in Texas. We're here today because of the unprecedented moment we're in. We're curious about the awarding of $1.2 billion in Texas and what that could mean for the energy source, the state economy, its people, the environment, and the grid. We are so privileged to have with us today the very people who can answer these questions for us. So please take the time and the opportunity to ask those questions. Dr. Wang, who is the Executive Director of the Texas Railroad Commission. Dr. Emily Beagle, Research Associate of the Weber Energy Group and the Energy Institute of UT Austin. We also have Liz Dalton, the Executive Director of the HyVelocity Hub at GTI Energy. We have Bo Delp, the Executive Director again of Texas Climate Jobs Project. And last but not least, our moderator, Jeremy Mazur, Senior Policy Advisor of Texas 2036. Before we jump in, a little about us. PowerHouse Texas was formed last year, only a year ago, by the Texas Caucus on Climate and Energy. PowerHouse Texas is a nonpartisan nonprofit that educates and cultivates energy policy leaders through these energy innovation forums, as well as through our Energy Policy Fellowship, of which I'm a graduate, which takes place during the regular session, as well as we are thrilled to announce the launch of our new Energy Policy Advisory Council. To help make sure that Texas legislators have access to the latest cutting-edge research happening across the Lone Star State, we've recruited a dozen academics from world-renowned energy institutes and universities right here in Texas with expertise on the energy grid, the energy efficiency, the electric grid, energy storage, carbon capture, hydrogen, air quality, and more. In this rapidly evolving energy technology landscape, it's crucial that legislators and staff have access to reliable, scientifically backed information in order to be able to develop evidence-based policy. Now, you can find the bios and expertise of each of these council members on our website. And if you see a striking similarity between one of our speakers and somebody on that image that isn't an evil twin or anything, Dr. Emily Beagle is also a hydrogen expert on the council. Before we go on, we really want to thank the chair of the Texas Caucus on Climate and Energy, Representative Erin Sweener, for her vision and leadership. We would also like to thank our funders, the Energy Foundation, Mitchell Foundation, the Jacob and Therese Hershey Foundation, Climate Works, and the Meadow Foundation. These are the people who have made this possible. We're going to start with an overview on the presentation of hydrogen. We will move on to a panel discussion with all of our speakers, and then we'll take audience Q&A, and we'll finalize everything with food and drinks. We will have a networking reception in room 1002 in the members' lounge with all of the speakers as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Emily Beagle, Research Associate with the Weber Energy Group and a member of our Energy Policy Advisory Council, an expert on hydrogen.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm excited about hydrogen in Texas, and thank you so much to PowerHouse Texas for hosting this event for all of you today. I'm going to do my best in the next 10 or so minutes to provide an overview about all things hydrogen and what hydrogen could mean for Texas. And I want to start with the question of why is everybody so interested and excited about hydrogen all of a sudden? And that's really because hydrogen is increasingly being considered a key decarbonization tool. And there are a few characteristics of hydrogen that are really driving its interest. The first is that hydrogen, the molecule simply H2, releases no greenhouse gases when it's used. The second is that it's a very versatile and flexible flexible fuel, molecule, energy carrier, and so it can be used across a variety of different applications, and it can be used in a variety of different sectors, almost all sectors. But what is of particular interest for hydrogen as it relates to decarbonization is that it has applications in sectors that we would call the hard to abate. So those would be the sectors where we might not be able to electrify, the sectors where we have the hardest challenge finding ways to reduce emissions. These could be things like high temperature industrial heat, heavy duty transportation, other industrial applications, and hydrogen has a role to play in reducing emissions from those sectors. And to highlight this point, I've included a chart that shows global hydrogen demand by sector in the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario. So in their scenario that shows how we can stay aligned with achieving net zero emissions globally by 2050, this is where they see hydrogen being used. So the height of each bar represents the total amount of hydrogen consumed each year, and the different colors in the bar represent different sectors or applications where we're using hydrogen. So historically, in 2020, we used about 80 million tons of hydrogen, primarily in the refining sector, shown in blue, and in the industrial sector, shown in green, which is mainly hydrogen for use as a feedstock to produce ammonia. But looking out to 2030 in their scenario, we now have a much higher bar, almost 225 million tons of hydrogen demand, and a lot more colors in that bar. So in addition to continued use of hydrogen for refining and in the industrial sector, we now have use of hydrogen for things like grid injection, which would be injecting hydrogen into our existing natural gas infrastructure to reduce emissions of that, hydrogen for use in transportation as a feedstock for ammonia, as a feedstock for syn fuels in the power sector, and also with buildings. So the main point is, as we look to ways that we can reduce emissions, we see hydrogen playing a really critical role across a variety of different sectors. And I like to show this figure when I talk about hydrogen because I think it's easy to focus on just one particular part of the supply chain. But if we're thinking about a hydrogen economy or building a hydrogen economy in Texas, it's important to think about what that entire supply chain might look like because there are energy requirements, emissions, and other resource requirements across the whole hydrogen supply chain. But we in Texas, we move molecules and energy around all of the time, so we're familiar with all of these different steps. They're not sort of new to us. But thinking about hydrogen's role or hydrogen needs across all of these supply chains or across all of these steps is really important. And that sort of starts with how we produce our hydrogen, because unlike the ways that we can drill for things like oil and gas here in Texas, we produce hydrogen from a number of feedstocks. Primarily, we produce hydrogen, about 95% of the hydrogen we produce in the United States, or 62% of hydrogen that's produced globally, is produced by a process called steam methane reforming. Sorry for all the acronyms here on this slide as well. That's essentially taking methane, CH4, and heating it to split it into hydrogen, which we want, and then it also produces CO2, which we generally release into the atmosphere currently. And so there's about 9 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen that we produce via that method. About 21% of global hydrogen is produced from a process called gasification of coal, and that has a carbon intensity of about 19 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And only 0.6%, or less than 1 million tons, of global hydrogen production is from steam methane reforming coupled with carbon capture and storage. So rather than releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we can capture it and store it to reduce the emissions associated with that hydrogen production. And we currently have negligible production of hydrogen from electrolysis. And electrolysis is using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen and getting hydrogen that way. And so if you use low-carbon electricity, you can also produce low-carbon hydrogen that way. So all that to be said, I like to think about the hydrogen economy really facing the dual challenge of needing to increase low-carbon hydrogen production while also deploying hydrogen in new end-use sectors, and then building all of the connecting infrastructure and distribution infrastructure that we need to move the hydrogen from where we're producing it to where it is that we're using it. However, I also see, as a result of this challenge, a lot of opportunities, particularly for states like Texas, for reducing emissions, for building out new sectors, and for all of the economic development and workforce development and jobs associated with all of those new technologies. And indeed, in addition to seeing that these models and these scenarios from groups like the IEA show the need for hydrogen, we're also seeing real-world projects for hydrogen being developed globally. And that's what's shown on this map. This is a map of announced low-emission hydrogen production projects, also from the International Energy Agency in their recent Global Hydrogen Review, that shows across the world the color represents the different sort of where within the commercial stage each project is. The symbol represents the type of technology, and the size, which is perhaps the most interesting, represents the size of the total projects. So happening all over the world, lots of different types of technologies and also lots of different stages of development, but some already in operational or late in financial investment decision. Overall, in aggregate, this map represents by 2030, 27 million tons of hydrogen production based on electrolysis with low-emission electricity and 10 million tons of hydrogen production based on fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. So we are seeing projects to develop low-carbon hydrogen production being developed and proposed all over the world. And Texas should really be a part of that because Texas is already a leader in hydrogen. We currently produce about 1/3 of all of the U.S. annual hydrogen production in Texas, so 3.5 million tons a year of the total 10 million tons that we consume in the country each year. We have 1,600 miles of existing hydrogen pipelines already in Texas, primarily around the Gulf Coast and Houston in that industrial region. So we're already producing and using hydrogen in a lot of applications in the state. We also have ample resources for producing low-carbon hydrogen, ample resources to support a low-carbon hydrogen economy across the rest of the state. For example, renewable electricity is a key input for producing low-carbon hydrogen, and we have vast resources of that in the western part of the state. We also have existing natural gas infrastructure and resources for natural gas-based hydrogen production. Additionally, the geology of Texas is well suited for storage not only of CO2, so if we produce hydrogen from natural gas and want to lower that carbon intensity, we have to capture and store that CO2, and you have to have the appropriate geology to do that, but Texas does. We also have geology to store hydrogen geologically, and there are 3 hydrogen storage caverns already in the state of Texas, so we're already a leader and have that technology demonstrated here within the state. And we're seeing action being taken across the state to expand hydrogen development here. 2 meaningful bills related to hydrogen were passed in the recent Texas legislative session. And I won't go too much into detail of these because I know they'll come up on the panel, but want to highlight the Texas Railroad Commission having regulatory jurisdiction over hydrogen pipelines and underground storage facilities, the establishment of the Texas Hydrogen Policy Council, as well as a grant administered with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality to support hydrogen in heavy-duty transportation. And finally, and perhaps most excitingly, Texas was recently selected to be one of DOE's regional clean hydrogen hubs. So the HyVelocity hub in the Gulf Coast region was selected as one of 7 hubs from the recent DOE project. This is an award of up to $1.2 billion coming to the state from DOE, in addition to all of the other investments from project partners. And I know we have a panelist who will talk about this as well, and represents an estimated 45,000 jobs. And so with all of that, very excited for the questions and discussion to come.
Let's start with what I call the 30,000 foot level question, and that is, why is there all this discussion about hydrogen? What makes it so important to Texas's energy conversation today? And to kick us off, Liz, I'll let you draw the short straw.
Well, I'm sitting in a short chair as well, so I'm going to have to lean in. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, ma'am. All right. I mean, really, Emily, you just laid out a fantastic presentation, and you should come give a lot of high-velocity presentations from now on. But I mean, really what she laid out is that clean hydrogen has the potential to be the Swiss Army knife of a clean energy transition. There are so many end uses. That is this ability to build on existing infrastructure, and its ability to drive huge economic opportunity in the region is why we are so excited about this. So as Emily mentioned, the HyVelocity Hub was just selected to negotiate up to $1.2 billion in funding to bring clean hydrogen to scale in our region. And there are so many benefits that can come with that, and we're going to have that as part of this conversation today. But the excitement is to do this in a way that just hasn't been done before. So HyVelocity, the name, conveys this, enormous opportunity in front of us. And our vision for HyVelocity is that we are going to do this at the pace that is needed to meet our decarbonization goals, but we're also going to do this in a way that strengthens and builds resilience, economic resilience for the communities across the region. So our view of this is that there's no one single entity that can do this alone. And this is why this hub program and this particular announcement is so exciting. This is not one developer. This is not one research institution. This is not one community. This is not one government body. This is everyone coming together and pushing forward a different vision for how energy infrastructure can be built across the Texas and the Gulf Coast region. I laugh a little bit is that we were sitting down at the table across from DOE sometime this summer as part of the interview process, and to have the Undersecretary of Energy say, man, it's not often that you're sitting in a room with a bunch of traditional energy competitors and renewable energy developers and community advocates together as part of a consortia of competitors. They were pretty blown away with that, and I think that it made a lasting impression for the region and what we're capable of as part of the scaling exercise. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it on, is that, part of this program out of the agency was to think about how you can catalyze federal investment and private dollars going into this project. So in the case of HyVelocity, it is up to $1.2 billion. We're still negotiating. We've just started negotiating. But that's matched with almost $10 billion in private capital to bring these low-carbon solutions to bear. And I know we're going to get into the details beyond that, but with, up to an estimated 45,000 direct jobs potential, I think McKinsey's estimate is another 100,000 indirect or induced jobs. We think this is a great opportunity for Texans. We think it's great for the region. We think it's great for the global clean hydrogen economy, and we're really proud to be here today.
So you actually, Liz, you give us a good segue to the next question. It's like, we see so much potential for hydrogen in Texas. I mean, given the infrastructure, our workforce, and our robust oil and gas sector. But let's talk a little bit about what are the economic opportunities here. And I'll start with you, Bo. I mean, what are the policies that we need to ensure that everyone can take advantage of the economic opportunities offered through the hydrogen opportunity?
Well, I appreciate that question. Look, I'm the executive director of Texas Climate Jobs Project. We think about this as a just transition opportunity. We think about the oil and gas workers. We think about construction workers. We think about supply chain jobs. And we think about how workers can get a fair shot into a just transition into the clean energy economy. And I think there's a lot of promise with hydrogen. There's also a lot of pitfalls. So when we think about, for example, it's been cited several times, the number of jobs that may be created, 45,000 jobs. To us, the fact that this is going to create 45,000 jobs, it's not a particularly interesting talking point. What is interesting is to talk about job quality. Are these going to be jobs where people are subject to unsafe working conditions? Is it going to be the kind of job where someone has access to health care? Are they going to have a living wage? Keep in mind, 47% of the workforce in Texas earns $15 or less an hour for their work. Black and brown families are paid tens of thousands of dollars less than white families in the state. So we have this incredible opportunity from a policy perspective to really think about what jobs of the future in Texas look like. If we don't get it right, workers are going to be left behind. And when I say workers, I mean oil refinery workers. I mean coal power plant operators. These are people who really just want a fair shot in our economy, who think about the same things that we all think about. How am I going to put enough food on the table? Are my kids going to be able to go to college? If my wife gets sick, am I going to be able to support her with my health care? Do we have a retirement plan? These are things that we all think about and that workers are thinking about when it comes to hydrogen. So we have to start to grapple beyond the number of jobs created and really talk about what does it mean to have a good, high-quality job in this industry.
Any other thoughts on the panel with regard to the economic opportunities here associated with hydrogen as part of our portfolio?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. So at the Rural Commission, we regulate coal mining, pipeline, oil and gas utility, and Bo, you mentioned coal plant workers. So we are seeing a decline in coal mining in Texas and also a retirement of coal power plants. So we think with hydrogen, that's a great opportunity for those skilled workforce to transition into a new industry, hydrogen. And I think we're blessed with state leadership like Chairman Darby with the bill HB 2847 establishing the Policy Council is sending a clear signal that Texas is interested in hydrogen and wants to continue to be a leader in this space. So Emily, you mentioned we have 3 hydrogen underground storage facilities. To put that into perspective, there are only 6 in the world, and Texas has 3. And we talked about high velocity area. Y'all have over 1,000 miles of pipeline. That sounds small because Texas have over 400,000 miles of pipelines. But that is also number 1 in the country and also in the world. So if you think about that, put that into perspective, and we have over 443,000 oil and gas jobs earning an average salary of $115,000. And a lot of that, whether it's upstream, midstream, or downstream, because pipelines, Texas has been doing this for many decades. The storage just didn't get built yesterday, and the pipeline didn't get put in the ground 2 years ago. We've been doing this and permitting and regulating this for a while. So for us to continue to be a leader, we're facing stiff competition from the United Kingdom, Australia, and China. So I think from a regulator or legislature perspective, the legislature is sending a strong signal to us as a regulator that, hey, Railroad Commission, we want you to put a council together, which we opened an application in September, and we received over 60 applications for 11 spots on the council. So we have done rigorous due diligence, doing background research and compliance, and we have selected 11 members, and the letter has been going out. And in early December, we'll make the official announcement and hold our first meeting. So the legislature wants us to study the future, get an understanding of our current state and where we want to be, and figure out the gap in between and see what kind of regulation that we need to promote hydrogen. We don't want red tapes, right? We want to promote growth of hydrogen to be another potential fuel type for Texas. We are number 1 in oil and gas, and we have the infrastructure, we have the leadership, we have the skilled laborers here in Texas. And also with the $1.2 billion, I think the only other state that got that amount is California. So DOE made it very clear between California and Texas, we're going to be the leader in hydrogen. And I kind of feel like we are behind a little bit in certain downstream applications, whether it's fuel cell. Their buses in the UK already run on hydrogen. Toyota is doing a lot of research that they claim can potentially completely replace electric vehicles if hydrogen engine can be put in place. And also LDC blending, for gas utility going to people's homes, residential, commercial applications. SoCal just announced they have a pilot project. We don't have one in Texas. UK, Northern Gas, they're doing pilot studies. They call it Red Car City. Y'all can look it up. I mean, they're blending 20%. So I know we have a lot of challenges from safety perspective, from the cost perspective, but we have 2 options. We either sit and see what happens, or we stay up front and be a leader and then set the tone for our industry to allow investment to come into our states. So I think the door is open, is whether we take the first step or not. But I think Texas is taking that step right now.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked a little bit about 2847 their way, because I think there were 2 major hydrogen energy stories this year. The first was the legislature's approval of House Bill 2847 that clarified the Railroad Commission has jurisdiction over hydrogen pipelines, underground storage. Emily, you said it very well in your presentation. And then also created the Texas Hydrogen Production Policy Council. The other big story that I want us to talk about in a little bit is the DOE's announcement creating the HyVelocity hub. Although I don't know if creation is really the right word. There's so many go, no-go points in the selection. We can talk about that later. But let's talk about the first story. Let's talk about 2847. And Wei, you talked about you guys received over 60 applications for this council. Where do you see this council doing now that the bill's passed and you guys are working on getting your members?
Yeah, there's very specific charges in the bill. I think Chairman Darby is very pointed in exactly what he wants to see the council do. So the 11 members, we try to be very diversified. We have research organizations and also academia from our universities here in Texas, as well as upstream producers, pipeline operators, companies that operate those 3 underground storages, and also service companies, and also downstream customers. And NGOs as well. So there are only 11 members, so it's a very small group. It's a very competitive application process. There are about 3 things that the council is supposed to do. Number 1, to look at our infrastructure, the future development of hydrogen in Texas, and monitor the clean hydrogen hub in Texas. Mm-hmm. And the third thing is to come up with a state plan in terms of recommendation to the legislature regarding oversight by the Railroad Commission over hydrogen production. Currently, there's no regulation over production. I don't think the bill is necessarily saying that we need production regulation. We just want to study that and come up with a plan. What kind of regulation, if any, we need to put in place to allow this to happen, right?
And that begs a question for Dr. Beagle on the far side of the panel. I mean, given the work that this very important council is going to be starting to do soon, what do you think are the hydrogen production policy issues that this council could explore?
Lean over or yell. Oh, now it's falling apart.
Still
All right,
working.
I'll just talk really loud. That's a great question. I think so. There are 2 main commercial hydrogen production pathways that everyone focuses on, particularly for low carbon production. That being steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage. Some people call that blue hydrogen. I'll spare you my soapbox about hydrogen colors. The other way is electrolysis with low-carbon electricity, which is often called green hydrogen. And so I think there's a lot of focus on those as the 2 main commercial pathways, as the only pathways. So I think there's a risk of not taking into consideration or perhaps writing policies, regulations now that exclude new technologies for producing hydrogen that might be developed in the future. So that's one thing that to keep in mind that I kind of keep my eye on is thinking about how we're not excluding new technologies in the future, particularly as it relates to production. I also, I sort of showed that diagram that there's a lot that happens in addition to the production, and so making sure that we don't focus so much, while the production is important, focus so much on that we miss some of those others. But I'm encouraged by the fact that when we're talking about jurisdiction over pipelines and underground storage, that we're getting that middle piece. So glad to see that was included as well.
Any other thoughts on the Policy Council?
This bill clarified the jurisdiction. The Railroad Commission historically has already had jurisdiction over intrastate hydrogen pipelines. Intrastate is about 196 miles of hydrogen pipeline, typically going from chemical plants to fertilizer plants, and also the underground storage. And I think regarding production, we have done extensive research on other states and even Canadian provinces. There's not a whole lot of regulation, but, hearing from our partners that hydrogen being the smallest molecule, right, there are a lot of concerns regarding pipeline safety, escaping from the pipelines. I think EDF has done some research on that. So just talking to other regulators in other countries, what is the percentage for blending? 10%, 20%, what is safe? So we think a lot need to be studied and researched from pipeline safety perspective. Another thing is, I don't know if you all know, when you burn hydrogen, you don't see the color. There's no color, and there's no smell. So just like natural gas, you probably have to odorize it, and then blending will give you that color, and the heat comes from the top. So for residential and commercial applications, if you're using it in people's homes, the question is retrofitting those appliances. That's going to cost money. At what percentage do you need to replace everybody's stove, heaters? So there are a lot of questions need to be answered from that perspective, but also on fuel cell. I think there's a huge market, and whether it's on-road buses or off-road vehicles. So, from regulator perspective, another thing is economic regulations, right? When you put that into people's homes, how much does that cost from burning gas versus burning hydrogen? And 20%. I'll tell you a story. When the British company tried to blend 20%, they told their people we're doing 20% blending. All of their customers thought that their gas bill going to be 20% cheaper. So when they got their bill, they figured out it's not the case. So I think there are a lot of public or community engagement we have to do to help people understand not just the economic impact, but also safety. So give them a holistic view and a realistic view of, how they may impact people's lives.
The real good news that we have with 2847 and the hub announcement was that 18 months ago, hydrogen policy was a huge question mark. I mean, over the interim, people were, pointing fingers back and forth, like who should have something to do with it. Everyone could see the potential, but the state didn't really seem to be organized for success. And I think now, between 2847 and the Terp bill that Dr. Beagle pointed out, as well as the HyVelocity hub, it's clear that not only has state policy on hydrogen gone from 0 to 63 miles per hour, but there's certainly a direction moving forward, which is positive. So the other big hydrogen headline for 2023, barring something good or bad happening between now and December, end of December, was the announcement of the hydrogen hub. And so, Liz, I know you talked a little bit about that earlier, but is there anything else you wanted to share about the hub's creation?
Yeah, and sorry, these microphones. Emily and I are breaking things over here. So, a couple things. And I would say, barring something by the end of 2023, don't forget the Inflation Reduction Act tax credit on guidance on 45V that relates to incentives around hydrogen development is also going to be a key policy thing that we need to pay attention to. But certainly big news around the hub. But I think there's a little bit, sometimes a misconception around how some of these DOE programs come together. So you see this headline, HyVelocity hub, $1.2 billion. I think some people think like DOE just does a strike of a check, mails it, and we're all up and running. And that's absolutely not how this program is structured, and it's not how really any of DOE's programs are structured. So the department has envisioned this to be a roughly 12 or 13-year-long public-private partnership between the hub entities and the federal government. And just like they do for most of their cooperative agreements, they have these, I think you alluded to them, these go, no-go criteria, where basically you agree to milestones, goals, objectives, you perform against those, and then if you meet those goals, then you are reimbursed. In this case, it's roughly a 50-50 cost share with the government. Then you get your money back. It's not upfront funding, it's reimbursable. And in order to move on to the next phase of the project, you have to demonstrate that you've done what you said that you would do. And that does include the community benefit aspect of this. It's not just the technical and the financial aspects of it. So DOE's created this program over 13 years, which will be kind of divvied out into 4 phases. And once we negotiate this award and we are under contract with the DOE, then you start phase 1, which they call their detailed planning phase. And that's when you're doing things like site selection. That's when you're doing deep engagement with the communities and getting a feedback loop into some of the proposals that we've put into place and understanding how we're going to chart that, how we're going to change that, how we're going to amend that based on the feedback that we're getting from communities, from labor, from workforce development organizations. If we do all of those things to the liking of DOE that we've agreed that we would do, then we get this go decision into phase 2. And that is truly the project development cycle. So that's roughly 3 to 4 years from now by the time that you're talking about permitting and some of those paths forward. Phase 3, 6 to 9 years from now, that's the construction phase of this project, and then 10 to 13 years from now when you're ramping up and operating these facilities. This is a very long project. We are at the very beginning of that. We have not yet started phase 1. I would just like to point out that the proposal phase of this was 5 months, and while this is building on decades of partnerships and work that we have done in this region collectively, the 5-month period to get together was a highly, highly competitive time. We had competition across the rest of the country. We certainly had competition here in Texas, speaking on behalf of HyVelocity. So we were relying heavily on some of those stakeholder engagements that existed with our partners, certainly with our community benefit partners, so HARC, the Houston Advanced Research Center, UT Austin, leading on workforce development, to get that input on the front end. But it's a long way of saying we're at the very beginning of this. We are following the phased approach that DOE laid out for us, and we're really excited to be in these negotiations. Hopefully May time period next year, we'll be able to say, yes, we've got this cooperative agreement in place, and let's get after this.
So I've tuned into a lot of these DOE seminars on the hydrogen hubs, especially after they did the selection process. Yeah. Was that in October?
October 30th, precisely for HyVelocity.
There you go. And they've been very clear and redundant in these seminars about their expectations with regard to labor participation in these projects. And so that leaves Bo. You're up next. And so, what's labor's interest here in moving forward with these hydrogen hub projects?
Well, I appreciate that question. Yeah, look, we're talking about $1.2 billion of taxpayer money being transferred to some of the wealthiest corporations on Earth. And I think it really transcends the political spectrum for taxpayers to ask questions about how that money is going to be spent and if it's going to be spent responsibly and in a way that's good for taxpayers. So I think it's important to really look at the facts. It was mentioned a second ago. Hydrogen is colorless. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. The Department of Energy tells us that it has a lower ignition energy than natural gas and gasoline. And we know that it explodes. We know, according to data submitted by the industry to the Department of Energy, that it results in property damage, it results in injuries, and it has resulted in fatalities. Now, keep in mind, the backdrop here is that, on the construction side, a construction worker is killed once every 3 days on the job in Texas because of unsafe working conditions. So somewhere in Texas today, someone is not going to go home to their family because of unsafe working conditions. Keep in mind, too, that Texas is the only state in the country that does not require any form of workers' compensation insurance coverage. The only state. And I talked a little bit about the wages earlier. So we have some real challenges that we need to address in the construction industry as we talk about construction. And so when we talk about safety, when we talk about apprenticeship, when we talk about wages and benefits, these are the things that we really care about and want to see. And so when we talk about transferring $1.2 billion to companies like Exxon and some of the other companies that are at the table with HyVelocity, we've raised issues around the need to talk about job quality. And we've heard one of two things. Number one, we heard what we just heard, which is this is a really long process. 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 12 months, 18 months. But this is where it gets really interesting for me, because when you look at the companies who are actually at the table for HyVelocity, Air Liquide, Mitsubishi, Bloom, AES, Chevron, they're all parts of other hydrogen applications across the country where they have been able and have, in fact, worked collaboratively with labor organizations to already figure out some of these workforce development questions. But for some reason in Texas, HyVelocity has not done that. The other thing that we've heard from HyVelocity is, don't worry, it's a long process, but working people are going to be a really important piece of the puzzle. Working people are going to be at the table. But I think the context here is really important. Keep in mind, ExxonMobil is one of the big companies that's at the table for HyVelocity. They just got done locking out a lot of steel workers at the Beaumont oil refinery just last year. There's another refinery. There's a company that's listed on HyVelocity called LyondellBasell. And they shuttered an oil and gas facility just last year. They announced that they were going to be shuttering it by the beginning of 2025. That's about 500 oil refinery workers who have decent wage, they have good health care, they have good retirement. They're losing their job. On an earnings call, it was reported by the Houston Chronicle last month, LyondellBasell announced they were going to be building a hydrogen facility, or they were exploring a hydrogen facility as part of HyVelocity. We have no idea what those jobs are going to be like. So we have to talk about the oil and gas jobs today. People are being told they're going to lose their jobs. They're having to go home to their family and explain that they may not be able to put food on the table because of this transition. So we've tried to engage HyVelocity collaboratively on these issues. We've been told it's a long process. We've been told this is just the beginning. I find it to be an exceptionally weak argument given the companies have been able to work with labor and working people on other applications across the country. So we're here ready to figure out what this just transition looks like. But we really do need to figure it out because we're talking about hardworking people who really just want a fair shot in this just transition.
So we're going to go to Q&A with the audience in about 2 minutes. But Dr. Beagle, since you started us off with your wonderful presentation, you're going to end us with the final question.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I want all of you to start thinking of wonderful questions to ask this panel. So you're up next. So Emily, to wrap it up, what can legislators and staff be looking to during the legislative interim, should it ever occur, when it comes to hydrogen policy solutions needed in Texas?
Perfect. Well, I have a few ideas. Thank you for the question. The first would be, so electrolyzers require a lot of electricity to produce hydrogen. And I know it's very scary in Texas to talk about bringing in large consumers of electricity onto the grid. However, some technologies also have the ability to shut off quickly or serve as demand response during the hot summer months when we see that we need to reduce our overall demand on the grid. We saw over the summer, similarly, sort of large electricity hogs, crypto mining, Bitcoin, et cetera, were able to shut off sort of on demand from ERCOT to help us manage some of those hotter days and manage our load, and in some cases made tens of millions of dollars to do so. So I think it'd be interesting for the legislator to explore if there's an opportunity for hydrogen and electrolyzers to serve as a similar demand response and sort of grid balancing, electric balancing in that way, since we're seeing other industries in the state serve in that role, and then we get the added benefit of those facilities would also be producing hydrogen for us. Another potential policy I'd love to explore, a number of these federal programs require cost share. And so thinking about if there's a way that the legislature can start programs that have funds similar or in addition to the funds for the TERP program with transportation to support and sort of set Texas up to say we, the Texas legislature, are willing to put sort of money down on the table along with the federal government to support research and development that we need for hydrogen, since there's so much money from the federal government, but it does have that cost share requirement. And I think the third and final point that I'll mention, we've talked about the great work with the jurisdiction for pipelines and underground railroads, and I'm sure the Policy Advisory Council will have the same idea as well, but there's a lot of different ways that we might transport hydrogen or store it or use it, and so certainly not just sort of expanding the purview of this existing council and regulations to recognize that it won't always be transported in pipelines, it might not always be stored underground, and making sure that we're not overly restrictive of the way we design that full ecosystem based on just some of the first steps that we're taking now with identifying these technologies.
Thank you. So we'll open up to a Q&A from the audience. Before we get there, I want to thank the panelists. It's been a great conversation. At Texas 2036, we're going to be releasing a report likely in January or February of next year describing the economic opportunities with the state's energy expansion. I mean, what can we expect in terms of GDP growth, state and regional job growth, and also state and local tax revenues if we pursue an all of the above energy policy that includes hydrogen. And the data that we're starting to see from this study is that hydrogen is a key driver for economic growth, especially within some regions. And so I think we did a great job of setting the table here for why hydrogen is going to be important and what are some of the key issues with regard to labor participation, health and safety that we need to be mindful moving forward. Any questions from the audience? I know I tasked you guys with coming up with at least one.
It depends on who you ask to your first question of whether nuclear to electrolysis would be considered green hydrogen, which is one of the issues that I take with the color because that's one of the areas where it becomes ambiguous. Some people will say, yes, because it's zero carbon electricity, it is green hydrogen. Others will say, no, green hydrogen is only renewables, wind and solar, therefore we don't want any nuclear produced hydrogen. So this is an issue with just talking about the colors. But when you start looking at the carbon intensity, yes, it is a zero carbon electricity powering an electrolyzer, so you would have essentially zero carbon hydrogen as a result of that. The other answer is yes, you can from the technical perspective, and there are advantages with pairing nuclear as your electricity source, or even in some cases looking at nuclear for the heat that you would need for other hydrogen production processes, and the advantage that you get of not having that intermittency and being able to use it all of the time. I think the biggest challenge would come in with the economics, particularly if you're looking at building a new nuclear facility, and then just the question of if you are building a new nuclear facility, is the best use of that zero carbon electricity to produce hydrogen, or is the best use to use that zero carbon electricity for put it into where all of our other uses for electricity. So technically, yes, it's possible, and it would be zero carbon hydrogen, but there are some of those other trade-offs and considerations with the costs and just the best use of that resource that become sort of location-specific, size of your facility-specific.
And to add to that, the amount of time and the ramp needed to bring another nuclear plant online is it's infinite. it, also known as 30 years. But yeah.
Yeah. And if we could indeed see some of those advantages of the small modular reactors where we are sort of through the factory scale of being able to manufacture them in one site rather than on their final location, that drives down the cost of those, that would be kind of a game changer in that technology, not just from its ability to interact with the hydrogen economy, but just more broadly in expanding the use of nuclear.
It's a really good question, and again, I alluded to this 45V tax credit. I think the economics of this have to be proven out through these processes. Certainly the tax credits and the implications for the carbon intensity of production, potentially getting into the carbon capture credits as well, will play a huge role in determining the economics of the final end-use product. We're seeing a lot of demand of that, obviously, in the Texas region, but there's a lot of international demand for greener, cleaner, low-carbon solutions. And so there's a lot of interest in Texas for the end products of HyVelocity, but a lot of international interest in what this can mean for maritime shipping, as an example, how this can flow into international supply chains as a domestic product that is exported. So I think when we start to see some of these market analyses come together over the course of the next couple of years, that's going to be a key factor. Where do these incentives come in? How much longevity do they have? And what is the demand side signal for that?
And one thing I'd add on is what we're finding in our models is that a lot of hydrogen production and development right now under the current regime is aided and abetted by the federal subsidies, like the 45Q for CCUS as well as 45V, and those subsidies and tax incentives do incite more hydrogen production up until year 2035. And what we're seeing is that after 2035, it just kind of the production goes down a bit. And so what we're taking away from our models is that we're not necessarily long-term bullish on hydrogen. But if you want hydrogen to really thrive and develop and be a sustainable energy resource, you need to move beyond the subsidy paradigm towards developing a market. And I don't know if that's what you were talking about earlier, Liz, but that's what makes it possibly work.
And maybe I'll add, as the one who started by talking about how hydrogen is so great because it can do all of these things, that what I didn't have time to show was a slide that says just because it can be used in all of these applications doesn't mean it should be used in all of those applications. So hydrogen can be used for residential heating or in light-duty vehicles, but so can electricity. And so it's a critical question as we think about, particularly if we have a limited amount of low-carbon hydrogen to use, that we be thinking about where is the highest impact use of that hydrogen, which sectors allow us to reduce the most emissions, which sectors do we not have other solutions for, which sectors allow us to have the maximum impact while minimizing the risks associated with deploying hydrogen. So that's something that I think a lot about as a researcher, and a critical question I think needs to be thought about, and appreciate the question to raise this in the room as a big issue to be thinking about in strategizing a future hydrogen economy in the state.
Well, everyone, thank you for taking the time to be here this afternoon. Please join me in thanking the panel for being here. Bo, Wei, Liz, Emily, you guys were wonderful.